Hey Ben,
Hey, Rob.
I think it may just be us because the other two people who are regularly present doing dev stuff both made it sound like they might not be able to make it, and then the other people from other parts of the project are also out this week.
Okay, that makes it easy.
Um, so yeah, I don't know. Anyway, FYI, this gets recorded. You probably saw that if you click through the link. Um, I don't know. Is there anything you wanted to talk through about the stuff you're working on? I know I saw you posted a bunch of new PRs that I have not had time to like really look through yet.
Yeah. Um, so the permissions one I think is waiting for a review, and the other I opened one on the database for if there's an error when importing versions, not to create a page that has no versions. So I made a PR on the back end for that. And then on the front end, I found there was a similar bug issue, of that the list of pages doesn't render because there's an error. And so I submitted a PR for a simple fix for that.
Awesome. Um, yeah, that last one would be super helpful, and hopefully it was pretty straightforward. I think
Yeah,
as straightforward as anything in that React app would be.
yeah, yeah. It was just like a ternary in the table view to just check if there is a version before it tries to render out the version's like creation date.
Cool. Um, bum, 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 bum. Yeah. Cool. I will take a look at both of those as soon as I can today because they should be relatively small. Does the importing one? So it just tracks. It's not the whole import that gets rolled back. It's just a particular page, right? If the page winds up having no versions.
Yep, it's within the like import record. Um, I'm not. I'm not
Uh oh, you're breaking up. At least I think it's you.
super happy with what it's not occurred to me. Like I'm just not rather that it would be a rather long running transaction.
Oh, I think I lost you for about the last 30 seconds, and then it all caught up in 2 seconds. So, can you really reset that?
Okay, that I am unhappy with deleting it, but was didn't feel good about wrapping it with a transaction because
Mm-hmm.
it seemed like that the transaction had the potential to be open for a relatively long period of time.
That's fair. I'll take a look at it and see if I have any thoughts.
Okay.
Um, I mean, it may also be that like the ultimate answer is just not really a great way to do that, and we just need to inform users of the API and places where we use the API that you just have to be more resilient to the fact that a page may have no versions.
Yeah. And I'm learning, just kind of getting a bit more comfortable with that import thing because it's pretty complex.
Yeah.
And it reasonably seems to need to be complex, but there's kind of quite a lot of flags around, especially there's like a create page flag, that
Yes.
I'm trying to like understand the intended behavior around some of those things and like how they should behave in like these conditions where there is an error on import, and like should that be a strong contract of like always create a page, or like a weak contract of like just kind of what that means?
Cool. I can actually fill you in on that one because it should be more well documented. Actually, I'm not sure if it's well documented. I'm not sure if it's documented anywhere other than the OpenAPI docs, and that may not say enough. So the genesis, so the idea behind that is to say like this import is allowed to add new versions to existing pages, but if it has a reference to a version that would have to create a whole new page, like just drop it. And the reason for that is because in the first system we started working with, which is Versionista, was pretty straightforward for importing data from. Like you just had pages, and those pages had versions, and those were like reliably, they were their own records over in Versionista's system. So like every time you pulled a new version of a page, you would reliably be getting a page that we knew was a page we wanted to track. And in the way we could query things there, even though ultimately at the end of the day we're scraping because they don't have an API, matched more to the structure of things that we have. When we started pulling in data from other sources, in particular Internet Archive, that was less true. So in Internet Archive, you have to, basically the way the process works is we use the CDX API, which is sort of, you can search for all the snapshots that match a particular URL pattern and time frame, etc. So we like search that listing, and then we go find the actual mementos, like the actual response bodies that correspond to each of those listings, and then we like create an import record and send it to this import endpoint. And the problem there is that because CDX is often relatively slow, and because we're tracking so many pages at some domains, in order to make that import process not like stupidly painful and slow on everybody's different sides, we decided to try and say, query for like a whole domain if we're tracking a huge percentage of pages at that domain. So like EPA, I think, is one where we just say, we search CDX for everything at epa.gov in a given time frame. And then we try and filter out all the ones that match pages that we should have in the DB. But we'll sort of inevitably end up with some that we don't actually want to track. And we didn't want to just like start randomly adding new things to the set of pages we care about. Like there's a time where that might be appropriate and a time where it's not. If you're trying to import a whole new page and you're like, hey, give me all of Internet Archive's history for this particular page, and we're adding that to the database, you want create page to be true. But if you're sort of doing a regular daily import, which is what we're doing most of the time, and that import will probably contain a lot of like spurious extra pages, we don't want to like create page records for those. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So that is the like.
I just shut off my video because yeah.
Okay. Hopefully you got most of what I was saying.
Yeah. Yeah, I heard everything you said, and then the video has cut out.
Okay, good.
Okay. That all makes sense. So can I slightly switch gears to, so I was kind of looking at next things to pick up.
Yes.
And I was looking at the like log all of the versions and pages that are imported from a single import.
Ah, yes.
Because it felt kind of similar to just like shoring up, like making improvements to the importer, and it felt good. It seemed like it was marked as priority. Is that something that we could talk about for a couple of minutes here?
Definitely.
Okay. I think like the thoughts I have are just on the implementation side of, like, I noticed that there's two other kind of JSON B arrays of logs that are like processing errors and import errors that are already on the import. And I was wondering if like I should kind of follow that pattern, like of kind of storing the data in the database in kind of like a JSON B array. And I kind of have some ideas of like, if I went down that path of like maybe consolidating the other error logs like into a single set of logs and then having a couple of like filters on that to get back the same behavior for the errors. But I wasn't quite sure about the challenge of like storing all the logs in the database. So I was like, that was one idea I had. And then the other idea I had was just like creating a file that also was like a file that like just kind of was a temp file that was opened on the box that was doing the import, and just kind of like writing individual lines to that file. And then like at the end of the import, like attaching that file as a blob with the thing and like putting it into S3 as like a separate file attachment. So like those were kind of like the two ideas that I had, was either storing in the database or like storing the log as a file and attaching it. And I wondered if you had suggestions on it.
I was definitely what I was thinking about when I was working through all the ideation on this issue was definitely your second approach of make a file and drop it in S3, mainly just because my assumption is that because we're trying to log more or less everything that an import did, like that's just way too much to stuff in a database row.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Does it still make sense to store the other errors in the database?
I'm trying to think. I don't think we even really make good use of that feature right now. So I think it would be totally reasonable. I don't think there's anything that like depends on it. I think it would be totally reasonable to pull those out and say the way you get those now is by asking for the logs and like filtering for errors. What I think the import still needs to have, I'm struggling to remember if we had a separate flag for this, is to be able to say that there were errors during the import, like whether it was fully successful, partially successful, or not successful at all.
Okay.
Because I think that's an important thing. Because most of the places where we do an import, there's a script that basically it submits the import record to the import. It posts it to the import endpoint, and then it pulls the get endpoint for the import until it's done, to sort of like hang on and let you know like when the import finally completed, and to exit with an error if if there were actual errors as opposed to just warnings in the import. So I think the way that makes sense to me to have this structured is the import record should still have some kind of flag that says whether there were warnings or errors. And that could be one flag or two flags. And then optionally, like whether every record errored or like the whole process errored or only some records errored. So you have a sense of like, oh, were there just some errors in the import, or like was the whole thing hosed? And then, but the actual list of errors and warnings we can remove from the database and put directly into the log file and just say to get those now, you have to go request a log file. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, that's all helpful context. I think the first pass I'm going to do is like write everything to the log, and then but maintain the current behavior of like writing those things to the database, just so we have like the sanity check before anything gets dropped or removed.
Yes.
And then once we're kind of happy with just that those files are being written, then we can kind of like do that later.
That sounds perfect.
And I think the other thing, like just to double check, like if I just do the PR of just like make the log file, save the log file, and like don't make any changes to the API, is that enough, do you think, for something for you to like review and at the very least, like, you know, do something via Rails console and like is that something that you would put into production, or do you think that it also needs to have the API part too?
Oh no, like if you start by not changing the API, but just also writing the log file, I think that's the perfect like size chunk of work to start with. And I would totally merge that and put it into production straight away.
Okay.
Okay, cool. It can absolutely come later that we have an API that then exposes that content.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I think that answers all of my questions and gives me enough to get started.
Awesome. Any other stuff that you were looking at working on?
I don't think so. Like, I wanted to try to burn down all the bugs, which I think the 2 PRs that I opened up are anything that's marked as a bug in Web UI and WebDB, or monitoring UI and monitoring DB. I think I didn't see any other things that were tagged with bugs. Mm-hmm. And like the log one seemed like the next one that had the most amount of like priority labels attached to it. So if there is anything else that you think I should look on or just like start thinking about, like background thinking about, yeah, tag them with something.
Okay. The one I would suggest after the log stuff, if I don't wind up getting to it before you do, that would be super useful, is not a bug, is a new feature, although we already have most of the stuff for it done, is add status field to pages. And so the idea there is that we used to not have an HTTP status as a top level field on pages or versions. You used to have to look at the like source metadata to get it, because not all sources actually had it. Mm-hmm. Now we're able to get it from all sources. And so we added it as a top level field on version. And that part is straightforward because the version is just a snapshot. So its status is whatever the response code was. Uh-huh. And then we added a status field to page. I think we added it to the schema. But we haven't yet written the logic to figure out how to update what it should be for a page. Okay. There is a description of the logic we want to use in that issue. But basically the idea is like we should have a moving window on pages. And so if its status is non-200 for some significant fraction of that time, then the page's status should become non-200.
Okay.
Right, because it's a little funky, because the thing that we've seen a lot of the time is that a page will sort of like blip down, and we happen to catch it, or it's a result of whatever system, be it Internet Archive or Versionista or something else that's scraping it, being too aggressive and getting it and recording like a 403 with the server saying, stop asking me for pages so fast. Uh-huh. So like a single version being like a 404 or a 403 doesn't necessarily mean that the page is actually gone. So we don't want to record that as changing the page's status. But if we see it repeatedly gone, or gone for a long period of time, like it becomes a 404 and then we see no versions for a longer period of time than we expect, then we should record the page itself as a 404.
Okay.
So we have, I think we added the field to page. We've got the field and the right values in it for version, and it's just a logic of like writing a job that goes through and sets the status, or maybe it's not even a job, maybe it's just a like before update, before save method on page or something.
Mm-hmm.
But haven't figured out, like, we know the logic of how to calculate it, but haven't chosen a specific design or implemented it.
Yeah. Okay. I will look at that if you don't get to it first. And I'll go and read on the issue. I think the one curiosity that I have is why it's something that you want to write to the database versus something that like is a query, like a dynamic query that you would just make.
Because the logic that we want to reflect is way too hard to do in a dynamic query.
Okay.
And we'd like to make it easy for somebody to say, like, give me all the pages that are like now 404s that have disappeared basically since we started tracking them.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, you're right. Like, that is a sort of generated non-normal property.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. If I get to that, if I knock the logs thing out very quickly, which I'm not so confident I will, given like having to look at file uploads and attachments and all of that, and file system stuff. Yeah, I'll definitely look at that. That sounds really interesting.
Cool. For the log stuff, we have a whole file storage layer with different implementations. So you'll probably want to use that.
Okay.
So that should give you pretty straightforward access to set up a thing that in development will just write to the file system, and in production will write to S3 and give you basic helpers for it.
Cool. That sounds great. Oh, I guess in terms of like where these things are running in production, they're running inside of a Docker container?
Yes.
And does the Docker container have some kind of temp file system that will work?
If your file only exists for the lifetime of the import, I think that should work. I haven't really dug into it very much, but there's inside any Docker image, you should have like a local file system. You just can't depend on it existing. You can't depend on it having a lot of space, and you can't depend on it existing, across updates to the image.
Yeah.
But that's why we would write it to S3 as soon as the import is done or failed or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Just thinking about it a little more, you're right, because the importer does download the import file in order to open it and read it line by line. So yeah. Yes, that capability is in there somewhere.
Yep. Well, so that we pull it directly from S3 into memory, or upload it directly from memory into S3.
Mm-hmm.
And you could also just store these logs in memory and then write them directly to S3. You might not need a log file.
Yeah.
I mean, whatever. A temp file might it would allow the system to make choices at a certain size or time. So that might be better. Anyway.
Yeah.
Sorry. I don't know, whatever.
Yeah. I'm not going to try to over-engineer it right now, but I'm just trying to get some pointers of like where to look for patterns to copy. And I think I'm good.
Okay, good.
Cool.
All right. Thanks for calling in. Sorry, like nobody else was actually able to make it today.
Oh, no worries.
Sorry.
So,
yeah.
Yeah. No, I was gonna sign off unless you have anything else.
No, I think that's it. Sounds great. If you're still excited to be working on stuff and want to call in again, this is every other week.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I'll try to make it.
All right. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Bye.
Okay. Bye.